She stood in the kitchen doorway, fingers wrapped nervously around a steaming mug of tea, eyes drifting toward the rain-touched window. Jack recognized that look. It was the kind of distant stare that usually meant she was about to say something difficult. He didn't speak, just waited, quietly sipping his own coffee as he leaned against the counter. The air between them felt heavier than usual, charged with unspoken thoughts. "I need some time, Jack," Ella said finally, her voice soft but deliberate. "I need to figure things out, about us. About me." The words landed like a soft blow. Jack didn't flinch, but he felt them settle in his chest, tight and unyielding. He set his mug down gently, buying himself a few seconds of silence, the kind that didn't demand a reaction, only presence. Ella wasn't looking at him, her eyes were on the window, as if her answers lay out there somewhere, beyond the streaks of rain and blurred reflections. "What kind of time?" he asked calmly, not out of anger or suspicion, but from the need to understand. Ella looked at him now, her expression etched with confusion and guilt. "I don't know," she admitted. "I'm not saying I want to break up. I feel lost. Like I've been living in a fog. I care about you, Jack. I really do. But something in me doesn't feel right." Jack didn't interrupt. He knew Ella well enough to recognize when she was battling something internal, something he couldn't fix by talking it through or holding her a little tighter. This wasn't about another man, or a specific fight. It was about her. About the space she felt she'd lost inside herself. So he nodded. "Okay," he said simply. "If you need time, I'll give you space." She blinked, surprised. "You're not going to ask questions? Or fight me on this?" He offered a tired but sincere smile. "No. I'm not going to hold on to someone who doesn't know if they want to stay." Ella's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and turned away, walking slowly down the hall toward their bedroom. Jack remained in the kitchen long after the sound of her steps had faded. He could have made it messy, could have demanded clarity or boundaries or timelines. But instead, he made a different choice. He knew love wasn't about control, it was about truth. And if the truth was that Ella needed to step away to see clearly, then the most honest thing he could do was step back and let her. That night, as he folded up the extra blanket on the couch where he'd decided to sleep, Jack wasn't sure if this was the beginning of an ending or just a pause. But what he did know, deep down, was this. He wasn't going to wait in limbo. He was going to live. Jack didn't wait for a sign from Ella. Once she asked for time, he gave it to her, not with bitterness or resentment, but with quiet clarity. He didn't flood her inbox with messages, didn't check up on her friends, and he certainly didn't spend his evenings trying to decode what time really meant. Instead, he did something she hadn't expected, he let go. The morning after their conversation, Jack packed a small weekend bag and left the apartment without waking her. He didn't leave a dramatic note or slam the door behind him. He simply needed to breathe in a space that wasn't saturated with her indecision. He drove to the coast, where the ocean air had always had a way of settling his nerves and silencing the noise in his mind. He found a quiet inn on a bluff, checked in under his full name, and turned off his phone for the first time in years. The first 2 days were still. He took long walks on the shoreline, the cold water rushing over his bare feet, reminding him what it felt like to simply exist without holding anyone else's emotions. He watched the tide come and go, the way it did without hesitation, without asking for permission. And somewhere in that rhythm, Jack began to feel the subtle shift. He wasn't waiting for Ella anymore. He was reclaiming something of his own. Back home, their apartment remained untouched. Ella had stayed, perhaps expecting Jack to hover nearby, to orbit her uncertainty with patience and hope. But when she walked into the living room that evening and saw his keys missing from the hook, a quiet kind of surprise passed through her. She had asked for time, but she hadn't expected him to actually disappear into it. Jack didn't leave out of spite. He simply understood that clinging to someone who was unsure would only erode what little of himself he still had left. In those quiet days by the ocean, he began to rediscover the things that used to define him: his sketchbook, the one he had abandoned when life got too busy, the guitar with the worn strings in his closet, the early morning jogs that used to bring him peace. None of these things were monumental, but they were his. And in the absence of Ella's constant presence, they began to matter again. By the end of the week, Jack was no longer haunted by the question of whether she would come back. That question no longer defined his sense of worth. He realized he had given her something far more valuable than time: he had given her freedom. And in doing so, he had granted himself the same. Ella, meanwhile, was unraveling slowly. At first, the space she requested felt liberating. The silence was a break from the emotional weight she had been carrying. But with each passing day, the quiet grew louder, more invasive. She had imagined Jack as someone who would linger, whose absence would still be marked by longing, by attempts to pull her back. But he didn't. And that absence began to feel real in a way she hadn't anticipated. She checked her phone more often than she cared to admit, expecting a message, a call, some sign of continued investment. But it never came. The freedom she had asked for now felt like a chasm, wide and echoing. And she realized something: Jack hadn't just stepped back. He had begun to step forward, without her. Jack spent the following weeks not just existing, but engaging. He reconnected with old friends over quiet dinners and weekend hikes. He began volunteering at a local shelter, where listening to the stories of others somehow helped him process his own. There was no grand transformation, no dramatic change in wardrobe or city or career. But there was a shift in his posture, in the way he carried himself: lighter, steadier. It wasn't that Jack no longer loved Ella. He did, in a quiet, complicated way. But that love was no longer tethered to hope. It had become something else: acceptance, maybe. A gentle respect for what they had, and a quiet acknowledgement that it might not return in the shape he once knew. And so, day by day, Jack gave Ella exactly what she had asked for. Not because he wanted to lose her, but because he wanted to find himself. And the deeper he leaned into that freedom, the more he realized he wasn't just letting her go. He was letting himself breathe. Ella had imagined time would bring her clarity. She believed that stepping back from her life with Jack would help her hear her own thoughts more clearly, free from the quiet pressure of his unwavering presence. But what she hadn't anticipated was that silence could be just as suffocating as the noise. At first, the apartment felt lighter with him gone. She could leave dishes in the sink without feeling the shadow of his routine. She could stay in bed until noon or pour wine at lunch without explaining why. No questions, no expectations. Just space, glorious, unstructured space. But that kind of freedom, she discovered, came with an echo. A hollow resonance that followed her from room to room, whispering the question she had buried deep inside: what exactly was she looking for? Without Jack's steady rhythm anchoring her days, Ella began to lose her own. The bed that once felt warm with their shared laughter and long conversations now felt vast and cold. The shows they used to binge together remained paused, right where they'd left off, episodes unwatched. She tried to keep herself busy: dinners with friends, spontaneous outings, long aimless drives, but even in the middle of laughter, there was always a pause when her mind drifted back to him. It wasn't regret, not exactly. It was absence. And it was louder than she'd expected. She found herself scrolling through their old texts late at night, rereading conversations that once seemed so ordinary. Jack's messages were always calm, thoughtful, full of little details. He'd ask how her day was, remind her to eat, send photos of sunsets or silly signs he knew would make her smile. There was a gentleness in his presence, one that had been so steady, she'd stopped noticing it until it was gone. What surprised her more was that Jack wasn't reaching out. Not a single message. No check-ins, no attempts to win her back. For someone who had always made her feel like the center of his world, his silence felt like a thunderclap. It forced her to see something she hadn't before: he wasn't waiting for her. The realization didn't come in a dramatic moment. There was no breakdown, no sudden tears. It crept in slowly, like the quiet chill that sneaks in through a slightly open window. One morning, as she stood in front of the mirror getting ready for work, she noticed how tired she looked, not because of a lack of sleep, but because of a deeper unrest. She stared at herself, remembering the way Jack used to gently touch the side of her face and tell her she looked beautiful, even when she rolled her eyes. That memory didn't make her cry, but it stayed with her all day, clinging like perfume on her skin. She began to wonder if she had made a mistake, not just in asking for time, but in assuming Jack would remain still, suspended in emotional limbo while she sorted herself out. She had believed, on some level, that he would wait. That love meant holding the line, even when someone stepped away from it. But Jack had chosen something else entirely. He had chosen peace. Friends started asking about him, cautiously at first. "Have you talked to Jack lately? He looked really well the other day," ran into him at the bookstore. That one stung. The bookstore was their spot. Sunday afternoons with coffee and dog-eared paperbacks. The idea of him walking those same aisles without her, smiling at strangers or laughing with someone else, felt foreign. It made her feel like a guest in her own memories. Then came the mutual friend who mentioned, casually and without malice, that Jack had started going to art classes again. "It's really cool to see him back into his sketching," she'd said. "He looks lighter, more himself." Ella smiled politely, but inside, something twisted. She had never stopped him from drawing, but she had also never encouraged it. She had dismissed it as a hobby, something he could get back to when things calmed down. And now, in her absence, he had found his way back to it. Back to himself. That night, she pulled out the old sketchbook he'd once gifted her. The first page held a pencil drawing of her, curled up on their old couch, a book in her lap and a blanket draped over her knees. The date in the corner made her breath catch. It was the day after their first fight, the one where she'd stormed out and come back to find the living room lit by candles and him waiting with takeout. She remembered how safe she'd felt, even in conflict. And suddenly, she felt the ache of something lost. Not because Jack had changed, but because he had grown without her. The freedom she had asked for had done something she hadn't predicted: it had set him free. And she was no longer sure if there was a path back to where they once stood together. It was a Sunday afternoon, the kind Jack used to treasure, the kind where the world slowed just enough to feel real. The sunlight poured in through the tall windows of his new apartment, casting long golden streaks across the hardwood floor. The place was modest, not nearly as large as the home he had once shared with Ella, but it was filled with touches that were uniquely his. A worn armchair by the window where he now read most mornings. Canvases stacked in the corner. A teapot he'd finally learned how to use properly. When the knock came at the door, it wasn't unexpected. In truth, he had been anticipating it. Ella had been silent for weeks, but a silence that felt increasingly heavy with meaning. Her absence no longer came from confusion, it felt like hesitation, like the space between a breath in and a breath out. And today, it seemed, she had decided to exhale. He opened the door to find her standing there, wearing the same blue sweater he remembered from a winter morning years ago. She looked the same and yet different, older somehow, not in age, but in emotion. Her eyes held a cautious hope, like someone reaching out with no guarantee of what they'd find. "Hi," she said softly. Jack stepped aside, allowing her in with a quiet nod. No dramatic reaction, no long stare. Just calm acceptance. That was how he lived now, in clarity, not confusion. She took a few steps in, pausing to glance around the space. Her gaze lingered on the canvas by the window, an unfinished piece of a shoreline at dusk. "You're painting again," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am," Jack replied. "Helps me think." There was a pause, long and weighty. She sat down on the edge of his sofa, hands clasped in her lap. Jack remained standing for a moment before taking a seat across from her, keeping a gentle but unmistakable distance. I thought about calling, she admitted, a dozen times. Maybe more. I figured, he said simply, not with resentment, but with a kind of quiet understanding. I didn't know what to say, she continued. Every time I picked up the phone, it felt like anything I said would sound selfish. Or too late. Jack nodded slowly. Maybe it is too late. But I'm glad you came. She looked at him, startled by his calmness. She had expected him to be guarded, maybe angry, or perhaps still hurting. But what she found was something far more unsettling: peace. A steady, unwavering stillness that told her he had made his peace with her absence, with everything that followed. I needed time, she said, the words almost a confession. I thought space would give me clarity. But what I realized is that it only made me see how much of myself was built around the idea that you'd always be there. He didn't interrupt. He let her speak, let the weight of her words settle naturally in the air between them. I didn't expect you to disappear so quietly, she added, a faint tremble in her voice. It was like one day you were just gone. Jack tilted his head, thoughtfully. You asked for time, Ella. I gave it to you. I didn't disappear. I just stopped holding on to someone who didn't know if they wanted to stay. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was honest. Ella looked down at her hands, her fingers still nervously entwined. I thought maybe we could start over, she said finally, and for the first time since arriving, her voice cracked. Maybe find a way back to what we were. Jack took a slow breath, his gaze steady but kind. I think the moment we stopped being us was the moment we stopped growing in the same direction, he said. And I don't think that's something we can undo. Not with time. Not even with love. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. So this is it? He nodded gently. It's not a punishment. It's just the truth. I care about you, Ella. I always will. But I've learned how to live without needing your answers. I found peace. And I'm not willing to trade it for uncertainty again. There was a quiet devastation in her posture, like someone trying not to collapse under the weight of a decision they thought they understood. She stood, slowly, brushing invisible dust from her jeans. Her eyes scanned the room one last time, not out of nostalgia, but as if trying to memorize the version of Jack she had never fully seen before. The man he had become in her absence. She moved to the door and paused, hand resting on the frame. Thank you, she said. For giving me what I asked for. Even when I didn't know what it would cost. Jack gave a small smile. Take care of yourself, Ella. And just like that, she was gone. No slammed door, no lingering hugs, no last words whispered through tears. Just footsteps fading down the hallway. Jack didn't follow. He didn't watch from the window or wait for a message. Instead, he returned to the canvas by the window, picked up his brush, and began to paint again. The light was different now, clearer. He dipped the brush in a shade of orange, soft and warm like a late summer sunset. He didn't need closure. He had already said goodbye. In the days that followed Ella's visit, Jack didn't replay the conversation over and over in his head. He didn't dwell on what she'd said or what she hadn't. There was no need. The chapter had closed cleanly, and for once in his life, he wasn't tempted to rewrite the ending. He continued living as he had before she returned, early mornings with coffee and silence, afternoons filled with sketching or reading, and long walks through the park that served as both exercise and meditation. There was something comforting in the simplicity of it all. His life no longer orbited around waiting. It existed fully in the present, in the now. Ella, on the other hand, returned to her world with a weight she hadn't expected. She had assumed that closure would come with some relief, that knowing Jack had moved on would at least give her permission to do the same. But what she felt wasn't relief, it was loss. A loss deeper than the end of a relationship. It was the loss of a man who had once known how to steady her even in her most uncertain moments. She began to notice the things he used to bring into her life that she had taken for granted. His calm when she was overwhelmed. His attentiveness to details she often overlooked. The way he knew when to offer advice and when to simply sit in silence with her. These things seemed small in the moment, but in their absence, they loomed large. And yet, the most painful part wasn't what she had lost, it was realizing that Jack was no longer hurting. He wasn't clinging to what they had. He wasn't hoping for her to return. He had healed without her, and that made the finality of it all sink in. Jack didn't gloat in his healing. He didn't seek out others to share his story, or portray himself as the noble man who had chosen dignity over drama. That wasn't his way. He had learned that peace didn't require an audience. His growth didn't need validation from anyone but himself. He found himself more connected to the world around him. He noticed the way the light filtered through the trees in the late afternoon. He spoke more openly with old friends, re-establishing bonds that had been neglected during his years with Ella. He even started mentoring a few young artists who frequented the same coffee shop, offering quiet encouragement without needing recognition. There were moments, of course, when memories of Ella surfaced. A familiar scent, a song playing in the background of a cafe, a line from a book they once read together. But those memories no longer held pain. They existed as part of his history, real, tender, but no longer defining. Ella, in her solitude, began her own journey, though it was far less steady than Jack's. She didn't regret asking for time, she regretted not knowing how to use it. She had asked for clarity and found only more questions. And now, as she scrolled past his name in her contacts without daring to call, she understood the cost of indecision. Jack hadn't punished her. He had simply moved forward while she stayed still. The aftermath was not explosive. No harsh words echoed, no bridges burned. It was quiet. It was steady. And it was final. Jack had chosen to walk forward, not because he stopped loving her, but because he started loving himself more. And in that decision, he found the kind of freedom Ella had been searching for all along.